When my neighbor showed up at my door at 3 in the morning and whispered that someone was watching my house, I thought he was drunk or confused. Then I looked out the window and saw the figure standing in the shadows across the street, completely still, staring directly at my bedroom. My whole body went cold. I had never felt so exposed in my own home, so vulnerable in the place where I was supposed to be safest. His name was Otis, and I barely knew him. He lived in the gray house next door, and we had exchanged maybe a dozen words in the 6 months since I moved in. But there he was on my porch in the middle of the night, his face serious and tense, telling me things that made my stomach turn. "Don't react," he said quietly. "Smile at me like we're just having a normal conversation. Whoever is out there has been standing in that same spot for over an hour, and they're watching your windows." I wanted to spin around and look. I wanted to scream, but something in Otis's voice made me listen. I forced my lips into something that might have looked like a smile and asked him what he meant. "There's a person standing by the oak tree across the street," he said. "They haven't moved. They're just staring at your house. When you turned your bedroom light on a minute ago, they took a step closer. I had turned my light on when the knocking woke me. I hadn't thought anything of it. Now the idea that someone had been tracking that small movement, noting when I was awake, made me want to be sick. I was standing in my doorway in my pajamas, with my heart slamming against my ribs, trying to keep my expression neutral, while every part of me screamed to run. My name is Jolene, and until that night, I thought I had built a safe and simple life for myself. I had moved into the small blue rental house on Persimmon Street 6 months earlier, right after I accepted a job as a veterinary technician at an animal clinic across town. The house was nothing fancy. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a yard that always seemed to need mowing no matter how recently I had done it. But it was mine alone for the first time in my 28 years of living. After years of roommates who left dishes in the sink and apartments where I could hear every conversation through the walls, having my own space felt like something I had earned. The neighborhood was older and working class, the kind of place where houses were built in the 1960s and had been fixed up or let go depending on who owned them. Most of my neighbors were long-term residents, retirees who had raised their children there, or families who had lived on the same block for decades. I was one of the youngest people on the street, and I could feel it sometimes in the curious looks I got when I walked to my mailbox or pulled weeds in my front yard. My family lived 2 states away in the town where I grew up. My mother, Denise, called every few days, always worried that I was too far from home and too alone. She asked about my locks, my smoke detectors, whether I had met any nice people yet. My father, Raymond, was quieter about his concerns, but he had insisted on buying me a security system before I moved in. I had thought he was being overprotective at the time. Now I was grateful for every sensor on every door. My older brother Franklin had visited once to help me put together the furniture I had ordered online. He spent a weekend assembling my bed frame and bookshelf while making jokes about my decorating choices, then drove back to his own life with a promise to visit again soon. That was 4 months ago, and he hadn't made it back yet. But I didn't blame him. We were both busy building our own lives. I didn't have many friends in town. My coworkers at the clinic were kind, but they had families and responsibilities that filled their time outside of work. I spent most of my evenings alone, which I told myself I preferred. I watched television. I read books on my porch when the weather was nice. I took long walks around the neighborhood with Bo, my dog, and waved at the people I passed without stopping to chat. Bo was a hound mix I had adopted from the clinic 3 months after starting the job. He had been surrendered by an elderly man who could no longer care for him, and something about his sad eyes and gentle nature had made me fill out the adoption paperwork before I could talk myself out of it. He slept at the foot of my bed every night and followed me from room to room during the day. He was the best company I could have asked for. My neighbor Otis was a mystery to me before that night. I knew he was somewhere in his 60s and retired from some kind of trade work. I knew he spent most of his time in his driveway, tinkering with a vintage truck that looked like it hadn't run in years. We said hello when we saw each other. We commented on the heat, or the rain, or the way the leaves were falling. But I didn't know anything real about him. I didn't know if he had family or friends. I didn't know what kind of person he was beneath the surface. That was the life I had built. Small and quiet and predictable. I went to work. I came home. I walked my dog. I called my mother. I fell asleep to the sound of crickets outside my window. Nothing exciting happened on Persimmon Street. Nothing dangerous. Nothing that made me feel like I needed to look over my shoulder. Until Otis knocked on my door at 3 in the morning, and everything I believed about my safe little life fell apart. Subscribe for more stories and tell me where you're watching from. Otis stepped inside and I closed the door behind him, my hands trembling as I turned the lock. Bo had woken up and was standing in the hallway with his ears raised, looking between me and this stranger in our living room. I wanted to comfort him, but I could barely comfort myself. Tell me everything, I said. From the beginning. Otis kept his voice low, like he was worried the walls might carry his words outside. He explained that he had gotten up around 1:30 to use the bathroom, something that happened most nights at his age. His bedroom window faced the street, and when he glanced out, he noticed a car parked across from my house that he didn't recognize. A dark sedan, maybe black or navy, sitting in front of the Hendersons' place. The Hendersons had moved to Florida 2 years ago, and their house had been vacant ever since, so any car parked there stood out. He didn't think much of it at first. Sometimes people parked on their street to visit friends nearby or to make phone calls in a quiet spot. But something nagged at him, a feeling he couldn't shake. An hour later, he got up for water and looked out the window again. That's when I saw the person, Otis said, standing beside the big oak tree, not moving at all, just facing your house like a statue. I felt a chill run down my back. The oak tree was directly across from my bedroom window. If someone stood there, they would have a clear view of my room, my kitchen, my front door. They could watch me move through my own home without me ever knowing. I thought maybe they were on the phone, Otis continued, or waiting for someone, but 20 minutes went by and they didn't move, not once, didn't shift their weight, didn't check their pockets, didn't do anything normal. They just stood there staring. Did you see their face? I asked. Otis shook his head. Too dark. They were wearing something with a hood, I think. Average height. That's all I could tell. I wanted to believe there was an innocent explanation. Maybe it was a teenager sneaking out. Maybe it was someone lost or confused. But everything Otis was describing felt wrong in a way I couldn't argue with. People don't stand motionless for an hour in the middle of the night staring at a stranger's house. That's not normal behavior. When you turned your light on, Otis said, they reacted, took a step forward, like they were trying to see better. That's when I knew this wasn't random. They're watching you specifically. My light. I had turned on my bedroom light when his knocking woke me. Just a reflex, reaching for the switch without thinking. Someone had been standing in the dark taking note of that small action. What do I do? I asked. First we call the police. Then we wait and don't do anything that lets them know we've spotted them. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. My voice came out steadier than I expected as I explained the situation to the dispatcher. A person outside my house, watching for over an hour. My neighbor had seen them and come to warn me. The dispatcher asked for my address and said a patrol car would be sent to check the area. While we waited, I asked Otis why he hadn't just called the police himself instead of coming to my door. Because I needed to make sure you didn't do something that would spook them, he said. If you had looked out the window and screamed, or turned on all your lights, they might have run. Or they might have decided to act before anyone could stop them. The thought made my legs weak. Act. What would acting look like? Breaking down my door? Smashing a window? 15 minutes later, my phone rang. An officer explained that they had checked the entire street thoroughly. There was no one by the oak tree. No unfamiliar car parked nearby. Whoever had been watching my house was gone. I thanked him and hung up. But I didn't feel relieved. If anything, I felt worse. The watcher had been real. Otis had seen them. And now they had vanished like smoke, leaving no proof behind. They could come back tomorrow night, or the night after, and no one would believe me until something terrible happened. Bo pressed against my legs, whining softly. I reached down and scratched behind his ears, grateful for something warm and alive to hold on to. Otis stood by my window, peering through the blinds at the empty street. They'll be back, he said quietly. People like that don't just give up. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. I sat on my couch with every light in the house turned on. Bo curled up beside me with his head on my lap. Every creak of the house settling made me flinch. Every car that drove past made me hold my breath until the sound faded away. By the time the sun came up, I was exhausted in a way that went deeper than just missing sleep. I called in sick to work for the first time since I started the job. I couldn't imagine focusing on anything, couldn't picture myself going through the motions of a normal day while someone out there knew where I lived and had spent an hour staring at my windows. My boss was understanding, told me to rest and feel better, and I hung up feeling guilty for the lie even though I couldn't have told her the truth. I spent the morning doing research on my phone. I looked up articles about stalking, about home security, about what to do when you felt unsafe in your own home. The statistics were terrifying. Most stalking victims knew their stalker, but a significant number were targeted by strangers for reasons that made no sense to anyone but the person doing the stalking. I read stories from women who had been watched for months before anything happened, women who had reported their fears and been told they were overreacting, women who had trusted that the police would protect them and learned too late that protection only comes after something goes wrong. I wasn't going to be one of those women. I refused to sit and wait for whoever was watching me to decide what came next. That afternoon, I drove to a hardware store and filled my cart with new locks, window reinforcements, and motion sensor lights for my porch and backyard. The security system my father had bought me suddenly didn't feel like enough. I wanted layers of protection, barriers between me and whoever was out there. When I got home, Otis was in his driveway working on his truck. He looked up when I pulled in, wiped his hands on a rag, and walked over to help me carry the bags inside. I hadn't asked for help, but I was grateful for it. The thought of being alone in my house right now made my chest tight. "You're doing the right thing," he said as we set the bags on my kitchen table, "making yourself a harder target." I nodded, but I knew that locks and lights would only do so much. If someone really wanted to get to me, they would find a way. What I needed was information. I needed to know who was doing this and why. "I can't just wait for them to come back," I said. "I need to figure out who it is." Otis was quiet for a moment, his weathered face thoughtful. Then he said something that surprised me. "I have some old security cameras in my garage, equipment I used to use for job sites back when I was still working. They're not fancy, but they record clear enough to see faces. I could help you set them up tonight," pointed at the street. "If that person comes back, we'll have proof." I stared at him. This man I had known for 6 months without really knowing at all. He had come to my door in the middle of the night to warn me. He had stayed with me while I called the police. Now he was offering to spend his evening helping me install cameras. I didn't understand why he cared so much. "Why are you doing all this?" I asked. "You barely know me." Otis's expression shifted. Something painful moved behind his eyes, a shadow of old grief that he usually kept hidden. 40 years ago, someone was watching my sister the same way, he said. She told people. She told our parents, her friends, even the police. Nobody believed her. They said she was imagining things, being paranoid. He paused. 6 months later, the man who had been watching her broke into her apartment. I felt my throat tighten. What happened to her? She survived, barely, but she was never the same after that. Moved across the country, changed her name, spent the rest of her life looking over her shoulder. He met my eyes with an intensity that made me understand exactly why he was standing in my kitchen. I'm not going to let that happen again, not if I can help it. I reached out and put my hand on his arm. Thank you. He nodded once, then cleared his throat and looked at the bags on my table. Let's get to work. The cameras captured him 3 nights later. I had almost started to believe the watcher was gone for good. Maybe Otis coming to my door had scared them off. Maybe they had realized someone was paying attention and decided I wasn't worth the risk. I was still sleeping badly and still checking the locks 3 times before bed, but a small part of me had begun to hope that the worst was over. Then my phone buzzed at 2:15 in the morning, with a motion alert from the camera pointed at the street. I grabbed the phone from my nightstand and opened the app with fingers that felt numb. The screen showed a grainy but clear image of my street at night, the oak tree visible in the frame, the Hendersons' vacant house dark in the background. And there, walking slowly down the sidewalk toward my home, was a figure in dark clothes with a baseball cap pulled low over their face. I watched as they stopped in the exact spot Otis had described, right beside the oak tree. They turned to face my house and stood completely still, just like before. The timestamp on the video ticked forward. 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3. They didn't move at all. They just stared. Then they started walking toward my front door. My heart felt like it stopped. I dialed 911 with shaking hands, whispering into the phone that someone was approaching my house right now, that I needed help immediately. The dispatcher told me to stay on the line and stay away from the doors and windows. A unit was being sent. I crept to my living room and crouched behind the couch where I couldn't be seen from outside. Bo was awake, standing in the hallway with his fur raised along his back, growling low in his throat. He knew something was wrong. Through the gap in my curtains, I could see the figure reach my porch. They didn't knock. They didn't try the door. They just stood there, facing the entrance, like they were listening for sounds inside. My whole body was trembling. I pressed my hand over my mouth to keep from making any noise. Then the figure reached into their pocket and pulled something out. I couldn't see what it was at first. They bent down, and I heard the soft sound of paper sliding across my floor. They had pushed something under my door. Red and blue lights appeared at the end of my street before I could react. The figure's head snapped up and they saw the police car approaching. For one horrible second, I thought they might try to break in anyway, might decide to finish whatever they had come to do before the officers could stop them. But instead, they ran, sprinting between 2 houses and disappearing into the darkness beyond my yard. The police were at my door within a minute. I let them in and pointed at the piece of paper lying on my floor, too afraid to touch it myself. One officer picked it up with gloved hands and showed it to me. 4 words written in neat handwriting. You shouldn't have moved. I didn't understand. I hadn't moved. I had been living in this house for 6 months. The message didn't make sense. The officers took the note as evidence and reviewed the camera footage on my phone. The quality wasn't perfect, but you could clearly see the figure's build, the way they walked, the clothes they were wearing. They said they would run it through their system and see if anything matched. 2 days later, a detective called me with news that made my blood run cold. The gait analysis and body type matched someone in their database. A man named Warren Duff. He was 36 years old and had worked at the same animal clinic where I worked now, but 2 years before I was hired. He had been fired for inappropriate behavior toward a female coworker and had made vague threats before being escorted out of the building. The woman he had threatened was named Simone. She had lived in my house before me. She had moved out suddenly 6 months ago, right when I moved in. Warren hadn't been watching me at all. He had been watching the house, waiting for Simone to come back. When I appeared, a young woman around her age, he had simply transferred his obsession onto me. Warren Duff was arrested 2 days later at his apartment on the other side of town. The police found photographs of my house on his computer, dozens of them taken over the past 6 months. But mixed in with those images were older photographs, pictures of Simone going back more than a year. He had been watching her long before she moved away, and when she disappeared, he had simply waited for her to return. When I showed up instead, he convinced himself that I was somehow connected to her, that punishing me would be the same as punishing the woman who had cost him his job. He was charged with stalking, criminal harassment, and trespassing. The prosecutor told me his prior history of threatening behavior would work against him in court. She expected him to serve at least 5 years, maybe more. I thanked her and hung up the phone, but I didn't feel the relief I thought I would. Knowing he was locked up didn't erase the memory of standing in my living room while he pushed that note under my door. I found Simone's contact information through a former coworker at the clinic who had stayed in touch with her. She had transferred to an animal hospital 3 hours away, and when I called her and explained who I was, she started crying before I could finish. I knew something was wrong, she said. I could feel someone watching me for months, but every time I told someone, they said I was being paranoid. My friends thought I was stressed. My family thought I needed therapy. Even the police said there was nothing they could do without proof. Why didn't you report him officially? I asked. Because he never did anything illegal enough to matter. He never touched me. He never threatened me directly. He just existed in the corners of my life, always there, always watching. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. I quit my job and moved away without telling anyone why. I understood that feeling now in a way I never could have before. The exhaustion of being afraid all the time. The frustration of knowing something is wrong but not being able to prove it. The loneliness of carrying a fear that no one else takes seriously. They arrested him, I told her. He's going to prison. The line went quiet for a long moment. When Simone spoke again, her voice was barely a whisper. Thank you. Thank you for not giving up. I stayed in the house on Persimmon Street. Part of me wanted to leave, to find somewhere new where no one had ever watched me through the windows. But I refused to let Warren Duff take my home from me, the way he had taken Simone's peace of mind. I had security cameras now. I had good locks and motion sensor lights, and a dog who barked at every unfamiliar sound. More importantly, I had Otis next door, watching out for me the way he wished someone had watched out for his sister all those years ago. Otis and I became real friends after everything that happened. We had dinner together once a week, taking turns cooking in each other's kitchens. He told me about his sister, about how she had eventually married and built a good life, but had never stopped looking over her shoulder. He told me about his wife who had passed away 5 years ago, about how quiet his house felt without her. I told him about my family, my job, my plans for the future. We filled each other's empty spaces in ways neither of us had expected. My mother flew out to visit a month after the arrest. She didn't say I told you so about the security system my father had bought me. She just held me for a long time and then helped me plant flowers in my front yard. Something bright and alive to replace the fear that had lived there. I learned that safety isn't something you can take for granted. It isn't guaranteed by living in a quiet neighborhood or locking your doors at night. Real safety comes from the people around you, the ones who notice when something is wrong and choose to act instead of looking away. Otis could have stayed in his house that night. He could have told himself it wasn't his business. Instead, he walked across his yard at 3 a.m. to warn a woman he barely knew, and that choice changed everything. I still walk Bo around the block every evening, but I pay attention now. I notice the cars on my street and the faces of people passing by. I wave to Otis when I see him in his driveway, and sometimes I stop to talk about nothing important. I'm not naive anymore about how fragile safety really is, but I'm not paralyzed by fear either. I know now that the difference between becoming a victim and becoming a survivor often comes down to one person who decides to get involved. I was lucky that person was Otis, and if I ever see someone else in danger, I hope I have the courage to be that person for them. If you want more stories, subscribe and tell me where you're watching from.